All right, everybody, welcome to Understanding the Aquatic Plant Rulemaking, a conversation with the DNR. My name is Mike Engelson. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Lakes, the statewide nonprofit conservation organization and Association of Lake Organizations in Wisconsin. I think most of you are probably members of Wisconsin Lakes and are familiar with us, and we're happy that you're here. A few housekeeping things before we get going. As I've been saying, if you can, please stay muted unless you're called upon. We'll have, I believe Maddie's got some blocks for some questions that I can translate to her through the chat. So if you can type into the chat function any questions, we'll get those. If there's time left over at the end, maybe we can open things up and have a question and answer session with an open mic session, so to speak. Remember that this session is being recorded, so of course, please be respectful both to the presenters and to the other attendees on the call. So with that, I am going to stop my share so that Maddie can load her presentation. And I'll just, as a way of introduction, DNR began working on revising these administrative rules for aquatic plant management several years ago now, I think it's been. And the proposed rule language is up for public hearing on February 22nd. So at Wisconsin Lakes, we thought we were hearing a lot of questions about exactly what the rules are going to do, how APM will change as a result. And so we invited DNR staff to come describe and discuss the changes with their members. So just to be clear, the session today is not meant to advocate for or against any particular portion of the rules or the entire package. It's just a chance for the department to describe the intent of the rules package and for you all to hopefully ask questions and gain some better understanding. So joining us to do just that is Maddie Johansen, who is the statewide aquatic plant management coordinator for the Department of Natural Resources. Her work focuses on program development and, not surprisingly, administrative rulemaking, particularly incorporating integrated pest management principles to address today's aquatic plant challenges. She has a degree in environmental policy. So I will turn things over to Maddie Johansen.
Right. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. And thank you to everybody taking some time out of your Tuesday to come and chat with us about the APM rule revisions. See if I can get my slides to advance. Oh, there we go. So we're going to cover quite a big range of topics today. First, I'm going to give a general program overview and provide some general introductions into the rulemaking process. And then we'll sort of hit the four, I guess, changes to the rule that we think you all should be aware of and would like to discuss with you. Those are planning, some changes and updates to the permitting process and the public notification process, and large-scale control and monitoring. And we'll end the session with more information on how you can get involved in the rulemaking process and how you can provide comments on the rule language itself. After each of these sections, as Mike said, we'll nest in 10 minutes roughly for questions. So, you can think of those while I'm talking through a certain section, and then you can put your questions in the chat, and then we'll go through the questions by section. So hopefully that works for everybody. All right, so to dive into the laws of Wisconsin, particularly relating to aquatic plant management. This is just Government 101 high level, just as a refresher for folks. We all elect members to fill our legislature, who then work with the governor to write the laws of the state that are called state statutes. They provide direction and clarity to the executive branch, which would be like the Department of Natural Resources, Department of Administration, Department of Health, et cetera, et cetera. And the executive branch writes administrative rules. Our program operates under NR 107 and 109. The authority for the aquatic plant management program comes from state statute. And our administrative rules have the effect of law, and the DNR writes these rules to interpret and implement state statute. You can think of state statutes as the general framework, and then the administrative rules are filling in all those cracks of how exactly we're going to meet sort of the spirit of the law itself. And we use the administrative rules to administer the program. Obviously, the Aquatic Plant Management Program is a regulatory program. The purpose is to first recognize and promote balanced aquatic plant communities, and especially to protect their vitality and their health. And also then to regulate the management of aquatic plants and other aquatic organisms to ensure that we are protecting diverse and stable aquatic plant communities. So that's the purpose of the program. The primary goal is to avoid then minimize harm to the plant community and the ecosystem as a result of management actions. And as most of you are probably familiar, there's quite a few different ways that we manage aquatic plants in the state: chemical management, mechanical harvesting, manual pulling, biological control, and physical controls. And our program regulates across that whole spectrum. This is a nice map just to break down where aquatic plant management is happening in the state and what kind of aquatic plant management occurs. This is from 2019 permit data. That big pink maroon swath there is private ponds. We're not going to really talk about ponds today at all, but as you can see, that's a big majority of the permitting that we do in the state. You can also see pretty clearly that management is concentrated more heavily in the more developed parts of the state, which makes sense. The navy or purple, depending on your eyesight, would be the chemical control of aquatic plants in lakes. And then the orange and the green are mechanical harvesting or dash operations. So as you can see, chemical control is the majority of what we do in the state. I believe it's about 90% of our permitting is for chemical control, and that's including ponds. So what drives APM in the state? There are social and ecological factors at play. Historically, the APM program was formed to deal with nuisance aquatic plants. So, you know, the classic, the plants are thick outside my dock and I can't get my boat from my dock to open water. That was the primary reason the Aquatic Plant Management Program was formed in the first place. The challenge on our side of things is that the term nuisance is highly subjective. One person's nuisance could be another person's prime fishing spot, as an example. So some of those social factors and the way we view our aquatic plants, depending on who you are and your life experiences, can shape how you feel about aquatic plant management. And in the more recent decades, aquatic invasive species are, you know, really the big driver of lake management in the state, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And AIS population control really changes the goals of management over time, and it changes the reasons for management over time. Your perspective shifts a little bit depending on whether you're just dealing with an aquatic plant nuisance or if you're dealing with AIS population control. Sometimes AIS can certainly be an aquatic plant nuisance, and so those can overlap, but that it just adds another level, and it certainly increased the intensity and types of management we saw in the state. So what prompted this rule change? As Mike alluded to, we've been working on this for a while. I'm not going to give you the whole backstory of how we got here, because I think we probably should spend more time focusing on what's in the rule language itself. But if you have questions, we can certainly go back to how we got to this point. But in general, the goal of this rule development is to clean up and clarify expectations around aquatic plant management. NR 107 and NR 109. NR 107 is written for chemical management and NR 109 is written for mechanical management. They're two separate administrative rules right now, and they were written at different times. So we would like to just put them in one clean, simple rule that combines all management options under one common administrative streamlined rule. And also to clarify our expectations. The way we write rules has changed a lot over the decades, and the way we administer programs as the DNR has changed a lot over the decades. So a lot of the components of the rule haven't changed, but maybe the way it's written in the rule language has been changed. And really, we just wanted to get back to the basics. Identify a problem on your water body, set realistic management goals, identify all the potential management solutions, implement the control you've decided on, take a look and see how that control worked and what its effects and outcomes were, and then repeat that process as needed. That seems really simple, but there's a lot of pieces there. And so the goal of the rule is to make that process as simple and streamlined as possible so we can make smart management decisions across the state, particularly incorporating integrated pest management. So administrative rule revisions, it's a hefty process. It's about 30 months. There are 6 phases with about 11 major steps. We are currently in phase 4, which is called the public hearings phase. I'll get into this in a lot more detail at the very end of the presentation, but I just wanted to give you a high-level overview of where we're at right now. I am going to, let's see if it'll let me do this. I wanted to show you now, if you Google search WDNR aquatic plant rules, the first web page that should pull up is our program's web page. And what we have here is all of the work that we've done thus far on the administrative rule is all of the public meetings, all of the white papers, all of the public comments, all of the answers to some of your burning questions are all on this webpage. There's a lot of information here, so I encourage you to come take a look if you want to learn more about how we got to the rule draft that we have now. That process started all the way back in November of 2020, and now we're all the way up to January of 2022.
And I did put the link to that in the chat.
Great, thank you. All right. So I'm about to get into some of the proposals in the rule, and the big thing I want you to keep in mind, all the proposals in this rule draft are just that. They are proposals. Nothing is set in stone, and we want your input on what needs more thought in this rule and why. That's a big part of the reason we want to have these public meetings with you all, so we can continue to fine-tune the proposals in the draft. So by the time we get to the end of this process, we all can feel pretty confident in what we've put forth. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. So I don't think we'll have 10 minutes worth of questions here, but are there any questions on the rule process or how we got to this point before I move on?
So far, I don't have anything. If you have a question, put it in the chat. If we don't get to it before we move on, we can get to it at the next break. So looks like we're good to move on.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go through the big changes to the rule in chronological order of the permitting process. So hopefully by the end, the conceptual program changes overall makes sense to you. So the big piece, first off, is planning. Actually, I'm going to give a little bit of background here. So currently, planning is only a requirement for mechanical harvesting. Obviously, we all know, and the DNR certainly strongly encourages plans for lakes. I'm sure a lot of your lakes have an aquatic plant management plan or a comprehensive lake management plan. Planning is a really key part of using our resources wisely and ensuring that we're, thinking long-term about our management strategies. So we're, the goal of incorporating planning more formally into the rulemaking or into the permitting process is so we can integrate that best management practice more fully into how we do business, particularly incorporating integrated pest management. What is integrated pest management? It is a decision-making strategy that focuses on long-term control and effective management to achieve your goals. The decision strategy takes information about how the pest species interacts with other plants, animals, wildlife, and the lake ecosystem broadly. It also takes information about the lake itself, the water quality, the wildlife that are present, the habitat potential, the development around a lake, and it considers all of those factors and looks at all of the available management options to come up with a sort of a list of available control options that would make sense to achieve your goals. IPM can help with aquatic plant management because it's effective and environmentally sensitive, and it uses all of the available tools. So that's going back to what I touched on: mechanical, chemical, biological, physical, social controls. And by using a multitude of strategies, or at least considering a multitude of strategies to come up with one or two options that are the best fit for your lake, can prevent a pest species from developing a tolerance to any one control technique. And it also reduces compounding impacts from repeated use of one tool. The other really important component here is IPM incorporates monitoring and evaluation. Without good information on what's happening underneath the surface of your lake, it's hard for us as resource managers and for you as lake leaders to make smart decisions about how you're spending your money, how you're choosing to manage your lake. So that's why IPM is a really useful tool. And as we all know, aquatic invasive species management is a long-term commitment. And so it's worth it for us to take the time and the effort to ensure we're planning how we're going to manage EIS effectively.
Hey, Maddie, before you move on, I have one question that's kind of definitional, so I think it would be good
Sure.
to ask it now. Carl asked, can you define chemical control of plants and what chemicals might be used? But so what do you mean by chemical control, I guess?
Sure. So chemical control very broadly means any pesticidal product intended to control aquatic plants. So that could be anything from 2,4-D to, actually, you know what I could do here? Why don't I throw this link in the chat so everybody can take a look here. Oh, I don't want to direct message you, Carl. I want to send it to everybody. These are all of the chemicals that are permitted, the herbicides that are permitted for use for chemical control in the state of Wisconsin for aquatic plants. There's a fact sheet on each and every one of them. You can also find more information on DATCAP's website. So hopefully that answers your question, Carl. If not, I can get into more detail. The key component is you're adding a substance to the water to control aquatic plants, which is different than, say, mechanical control, where you are using an implement or a tool to manually or physically remove aquatic plants from the body of water. So that's kind of the distinction. All right. Coming back to this, obviously, I'm sure you're all wondering who will need a plan under the new rule. We're proposing that you'll need a plan on your lake if you are conducting large-scale management, if you are managing aquatic invasive species populations, or if you are controlling aquatic plants for navigation beyond the riparian access zone. However, you will not need a plan if you're controlling a pioneering NR40 prohibited species population. So say you get a new population of starry stonewort as an example in your lake, a pioneering population by definition. We would hold off on requiring a plan until maybe some first steps are made, and a plan would come after that initial step. Also, if you're working under an existing surface water planning grant, you wouldn't need to do an additional plan through our program. That planning process through the grant program would be considered sufficient. Or if you're operating under a DNR made best management practice for your water body, this is a new component that we're proposing in the rule. So none of these exist yet. I just want to be clear about that, but we've put that provision in here. And also, if you're creating riparian access lane to open water, so you're working in that 30-foot zone to get your boat to open water from your dock, we would say you do not need a plan. How will the planning process work? We're proposing the plans are updated every 5 years. Plans will outline clear goals and objectives, name situations when control is needed, list what types of control may be used in different situations. That's getting back to integrated pest management and sort of scenario planning, and also outlining a plan to set future goals. So how you're going to take your monitoring data, as an example, to decide next steps. As part of that plan, you'll need some plant data, water quality data, and basic habitat data. Plans will be built off templates provided by us at the DNR. The goal is to make this a really focused, simple, and easy to follow process. That, if your lake organization is really gung-ho and wants to, do a plan, you could certainly do that yourself without having to hire outside help. We understand a lot of folks will probably still maybe want to hire some outside help to do some of the components or the writing, but our goal is to make the process so that you do not have to. And a lot of the data that we're talking about in these planning components is publicly available on DNR web pages. As for the timeline of how the planning process will work, it's kind of the clock is set back from when the day you submit a permit to the department. The goal of that being so that the biologist has plenty of time to review your plan before we get to the permitting phase. So about 30 days before you're going to finish up writing your plan, I'd like you to let your biologist know you intend to write a plan. And in that 30-day window, your biologist may request a meeting to check in with you. And then once your plan is written, we ask that you hold a 21-day public comment period that is advertised in 2 ways, one in your local newspaper and one other medium. We list a couple options in the rule. Some of them are, posting it on your lake organization's webpage or an online news site or a Facebook page, or there's a couple options. And all comments that you receive in that comment period should be added as an appendix to your plan, so that they stay with your plan throughout the life of it. After that comment period is done, you submit your plan to the biologist at least 60 days before submitting a permit. So most permits come in to us for lakes probably between the months of March and May. So timeline wise, you're probably December, January, trying to get your plans to the biologist. And the biologist has 45 days to review the plan, provide feedback, and approve the plan. And then that gives a little 15-day window in the case of any unforeseen circumstances before the permit comes in. What about plan updates? So you've made your initial plan and you're 5 years down the road. Do you have to go through the whole planning process again? And the answer is not necessarily. At that 5-year time, you would conduct some baseline monitoring, including a point intercept survey, and update your management history. So essentially, what control did you do the past 5 years? And you just write that down. And then if that data shows that no changes are needed to the plan, then the biologist can approve your existing plan for an additional 5 years. So with a PI survey and an updated management history, your plan could live a life of 10 years before we would ask that you, look at all of the different components of the planning process again. So that's kind of a high level overview of what we're proposing for planning. Are there any questions?
Yeah, we've got a number of questions that have come in. I'll try to get to all of them. A couple of people asked about the templates, where they can be found or if they're available yet.
They are not, but that is a very high priority to do for us. We certainly want to have those available for folks to look at and make comments on before we get to rule implementation. Yep.
All right. Will a group need a plan to manage AIS population even if they're only doing so with manual removal? I can't read today, apparently.
As written now, yes. Actually, yes, as it is written now. Mm-hmm.
Well, Maddie, this is Carol Shaw. I think the law says that if you're hand pulling invasive species, you don't need a permit.
We were talking about dash. Are we actually talking about hand pulling? I'm sorry if I.
Well, if it's any mechanically assisted, yes, correct. But there can be manual removal of an invasive species when you find it.
Yeah, so thanks for the clarification, Carol. Sorry, that's my bad, Mike. I just immediately assumed dash. So if you're strictly hand pulling, there is a waiver from the permitting process entirely, which would mean you are waived from the planning process as well. If you're doing dash work, then as is written, a plan would be required.
Great. And for those of you who don't know, that was Carol Shaw. Welcome, Carol. He's the Lakes and Rivers Section Chief of the Bureau of Water Quality at DNR. So Maddie's supervisor, I guess I would call him, right?
Yes.
So a couple more questions on this topic. Question about lake associations being required to publish a notice like they were a government. So even though a lake association is a nonprofit organization, this would require the association to publish a notice?
Yes, essentially it would be a public comment period on the plan. The goal of that being so either lake association members who weren't actively involved in the planning process or local members of the public who use and access that lake who may be interested in the planning process and would like to provide comments. That's the goal of that public notice, is just to notify folks that there's a comment period and folks can take a look at the plan and provide comments.
All right. A question about who when you refer to the biologist, who are you referring to?
Yes. So across the state, we've got regional lakes biologists who are also the regional plant coordinators, aquatic plant management coordinators, who issue permits and are responsible for reviewing plans and permits for aquatic plant management. So that's who I was referring to.
All right. And a couple of other simple questions I'll give both of them to you right away. First, is there a minimum lake size that requires a plan? And what's a point intercept survey?
Sure. So the threshold acreage is 10 acres. So below 10 acres, a plan is automatically, regardless of management, is waived. Over 10 acres, those scenarios that I went through here come into play. As for a point intercept survey, it is a standardized and repeatable monitoring survey that's done on a lake. It uses GPS points to make it sort of, you can think of it like a grid on a lake where you take a boat and go point to point and use a rake and collect information about the plant species at that point. That's a really simplified breakdown, but the goal of the survey overall is to get a detailed look at the aquatic plant populations that are under this water surface. So the types of plants, how big the populations are, where they are in the lake. So sort of an underwater map, if you will, of the aquatic plant populations. And so obviously that information can be used to see where aquatic invasive species are, to see where, if they're mixed for an example, with a bunch of native plants, or if there's, big stands of Eurasian water milfoil as an example that are sort of taking over a section of the lake. So it can give us a lot of information.
Great. Dan, I think is just pointing out that if you use hand harvesting with divers, not DASH, you still need a plan to get a grant. So just because you may not need a plan to do that activity, if you want to get a surface water grant, you still need a plan, is what he's saying. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I would guess that it probably is.
I think Allie's on the call.
And Allie does confirm in the chat
There you
that
go.
is true. So Judith asks, when is all this set to be implemented? Which is probably a potentially more loaded question than she realizes, but do we have a sense of when all of this would be finished?
Yeah, I'll get into that. So just hang on.
Sure,
and
that'll come towards then. That's true.
Yep.
A question from Mark about who does that point intercept survey?
We're not very specific in the rule. Essentially, an accredited person to conduct point intercept surveys. Most of your contractors for chemical control or mechanical control most likely conduct point intercept surveys. Most lakes consultants can also do that work. I think it'd be a good idea for us to make a list to be available for folks. So when this comes around, folks know who they can contact to get that work done. Yeah. Great.
And then I think one more before we move on, and we can always get back to these at the end too. But and I think this is actually an important clarification to make, because I think it does sometimes get confusing. What's the relationship between this process and surface water planning grants? How do they? You talked a little bit about that, but just so everyone's really clear, go over that again if you could.
So essentially, if you're operating under a surface water grant, you just follow the surface water grant planning guidelines, timelines, all of that. And that sort of supersedes what we have in our administrative rules. So we're just saying for our program, if you've got a grant, you just operate under the grant process. Just to keep it really simple. If you're not operating under a grant, if your project isn't grant funded, then you need to follow the process with the criteria that we've outlined here. I will say we're working internally to sort of nest these more focused aquatic plant management plans into the surface water grants program as well, so that we have some good cross-program, so that the programs work well together when they need to. But just think of it, if you're getting a surface water grant, just focus on that and follow that process. And that's all you need to worry about.
All right. And I think we're doing well on time, and I think we're ready to move on to the next section.
All right. All right, the permit process and public notification. So you've gone through the planning process if you needed to. If you didn't need to, then you just, tune in right here. One of the main changes that I did want to highlight for folks is we are proposing a fee increase of a $75 base fee that's non-refundable, and then a $50 per acre fee capped at $2,500. This was done primarily because the fees, particularly for chemical control, were set in 1989. And as you can imagine, things are more expensive now than they were in 1989. And the program has grown a lot since then. And these fee increases are really to ensure we have adequate staff to fund the program. Another big change here is public notification. I don't know if folks are familiar with public notification now. Currently for chemical control, public notification is required for large-scale chemical control options, and the responsibility is on the permit applicant to do a newspaper public notification. So we're proposing to sort of set aside that process and instead say that all lake permits over 10 acres that are posted or that are submitted to the DNR will be posted for 14 days for public notification. This is done to give the public an opportunity to comment on the permit before the DNR reviews the permit. So that component of it has not changed, but we're proposing to take that responsibility as the DNR and just expand it to any lake permit over 10 acres. We're going to take that 14 days to give folks the opportunity to provide input on that permit application. And then after that 14 days, here is the proposed timelines for permits. First is 45 days for wild rice waters or waters in the ceded territory, 30 days for permits with large scale effects, and 21 days for all other permits. And just as a note, 21 days is the same amount of time as we have now, only now in our rules, it's by business days. So we haven't actually expanded the time there. It's just written by calendar days instead of business days, just to keep things consistent. With that, when you've submitted a permit through the e-permitting system, we're also proposing that a copy of that application should be sent to all affected persons or organizations on the body of water within 5 days after sending a permit to the department. This is again to let everybody know who lives on the lake that a permit has been submitted for that water body. And how this is done is up to you as the permit applicant. There are some options we've got listed. So it's not anything goes, but we're not super rigid about the way that that is done. It could be done via mail, via email. I believe there's one other option. Essentially, it's the responsibility of the permit applicant to determine what's the best way to notify all of the riparians on your water body. So all of your neighbors. And why are we asking to do this? Public waters are shared waters, and everyone has the right to know what's going on in and on the lake, particularly the folks that live around the lake. So you've got your plan, you got your permit sent to us, everything checks out, we approve your permit. Now what happens? So we're proposing a new component to notify members of the public and your neighbors of upcoming control by posting 2 signs at all public access points on your lake. Now, if you don't have public access points, then this provision doesn't apply to you. But if you have, any public boat launches as an example, or public easements or parks, we ask that 2 signs are posted within roughly 5 days after the permit is approved. That sign should include the dates of control, the map of control areas, and URLs to the permit and the plan. The sign should be up and visible until all control is done for the season. And the DNR will provide template signage, so you can print those off yourself and use the templates to put your information in. Why are we proposing this requirement? Again, public waters are shared waters, and we think this may be the best way to let members of the public know what's going on a lake, even to remind folks who live on the lake who maybe aren't very involved with aquatic plant management, just so when folks are going to access the water, they're aware of any aquatic plant management activities that may be occurring around the time that they're planning to be on the water. So, any questions there?
All right, just a couple so far. Again, you can type your questions into the chat if you have them. First question is the fee change for both chemical and mechanical permits?
Yes, we set the fees to be the same for both. The one caveat, I should mention that in here, and that's actually a good distinction I should have added, is mechanical harvesting permits will be issued for 5 years with a plan, and chemical permits are issued annually. So actually, this isn't quite accurate. I should show the split. We do have a one-pager on the fee increase that we will be posting on our website that breaks it down much more clearly. But for that 5-year mechanical permit, for the subsequent 4 years after the first, you just pay half of the first year's fee. So say the first year you're doing a huge mechanical harvesting operation that caps out at $2,500, then the next year it would be $1,250, $1,250, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So it is a little bit different, but the actual acreage number and the base fee number are the same.
All right. Is 10 acres, is that the size of the lake or the size of the treatment area?
That's the size of the lake.
Okay. Question about the signage. Why 2 signs at each public access point? Karen says they have 1 public boat launch and several small public access paths that lead to the water, and 2 signs would need to be practically on top of one another. So what if the landing is small, basically?
Yeah, it's a good comment, and we've thought about that. The reason we said 2 signs is because in the draft, we just have those signs as 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and we were trying to think of the best way to get all the information on one piece, and we kind of thought it through and determined that one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, the information would be so crunched and so small, it wouldn't really be very useful, versus splitting that information over 2 pages would allow for one of those sheets to be a map, as an example, with the URLs to the permit and the plan, and the other one could have the dates and some other information. So that's why we said 2, but I'm certainly curious to hear input from folks in the public comment phase on those signs and how we could think about working that out.
Sure. I think that answers that question. A question about what the definition exactly of wild rice waters is. This person has is on a southern lake that has southern wild rice and is wondering if that counts, or what exactly wild rice waters mean.
Well, the DNR has a list of designated wild rice waters, and Carol probably has more details than I do on that list. I believe we're updating it now, correct?
Yeah, it's been updated. If you go on our website to the surface water data viewer, where you can look at lakes, and you can call up a layer called wild rice, and it'll show whether your lake is considered a wild rice water. It's mostly in the ceded territories in the north. I see his questions mostly about southern rice. It's yet to be seen what there's a wild rice management plan being proposed, and whether that would affect southern wild rice, maybe in the future, but right now we're really looking at the northern tier of the state. So I guess if rice is coming into their lake, it's probably not going to be on that layer, but they could always go look.
Sure. Can the same contractor who performs the chemical treatment or weed removal also perform the point intercept survey?
Yes, we have no provisions that say that can't be the case.
Okay. Next question is regarding harvesting. Greg says harvesting is mostly volunteer. Specific times are hard to predict. Is a general notice adequate?
Yeah, so what we have in the rule language, I believe, is if when you first put the signs up, you don't know specifically when you're going to be doing it, just a rough window is fine. But then when you get your plan set out and you do know when you're going to be out on the water, just ask that you come back and update that date on the sign so folks have a hard date. But right away, you're correct. You might not know, if you submitted your permit in March, you might not know until June exactly when you're going to be out there working. So.
Question from Janine, is this signage required under the surface water grant as well?
I don't believe so, but even if this was a surface water grant funded project, you're still have to get a permit through the aquatic plant management program and you would follow our signage process.
Right. Just a couple comments. I'll read them into the record, so to speak. You can take them if you deal with them if you'd like to.
Sure.
Two signs at each access point does seem excessive is one, and $2,500 for a small dash operation, say a half day, seems steep. And so people know that this is being recorded, and the chat is actually being, the chat will be recorded as well. It'll be downloadable. So I'll be able to get this information to Maddie so that comments like these can be seen. You'll also have opportunities to comment directly to DNR later on, and Maddie will get into that at the end of the session, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, thanks for your comments. And I would be very surprised if we got a dash permit for $2,500, since it'd be what, roughly a 50-acre dash treatment. That would be quite something, for sure.
Maybe one more question before we move on. How detailed would the notice of when mechanical harvesting will be done? If weather's bad during the week, sometimes harvesting is done on the weekends and it's unpredictable. So again, sort of a question about the timing of the notice.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, we don't really get into too much detail in the rule language on that component. I think there is just sort of a measure of common sense and reasonable information provided there. So, you know, if you say you're going to be out there on a weekend and then you don't make it, you know, it's something we should think about, though. It's a good question. I don't have a clear answer for you because we haven't put too much detail on that in the rule yet.
Duly recorded and in the hopper to be thought about is what it sounds
yes.
like. So.
Yeah.
All right. That's all we have on that section. So I think we can move on.
All right. Now we're into monitoring and large scale control. So what's the fuss about large scale control efforts? From the DNR's perspective and from your perspective, large scale control can be time consuming and costly to plan and conduct. And additionally, when we're talking about large scale control, we can see large scale effects. And remember, all the way back to the purpose of this program is to protect and preserve vital aquatic habitats. So as a result, the DNR wants to make sure that large scale control works as planned and it met our goals of management, and that the control didn't cause unnecessary harm to fish, wildlife, plants, or water quality. And, you know, as I brought up earlier, monitoring is a key component of integrated pest management. It's smart management. It allows us to make informed decisions, both with how we choose to use our resources and how we manage our lakes. So, large-scale chemical control in the new rule. Control is considered large-scale when it affects a significant part of the lake, stream reach, or wetland. You know, we've learned a lot over the years about how chemicals move through water, and you know, not too much of a shocker, chemicals move quickly through the water and often have effects beyond where they are applied. Think about a dropper of dye into a bathtub of water and how that dilutes. So where we put chemicals isn't necessarily where they stay in the water. So what we're proposing in the rule is not a hard threshold for chemical control. So this is a bit of a change. We're proposing to look at the herbicide concentration calculation. And that calculation looks at the herbicide, the specific herbicide you're going to use, the rate you're going to use it at, the label rate you're going to use, and the volume of water at which you're going to apply. So say they're going to apply in a 10-acre portion of the northeast side of your lake and it's 5 feet deep, that component goes into that calculation with the rate. And you use that calculation to determine when you will reach whole lake effects or large scale effects with that chemical control. Because again, just because you're applying to one part of the water doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be impacting the entire water. So that calculation will be a part of the permit application. And if that calculation shows there won't be large scale impacts, then associated monitoring would not be required. So this is sort of a move away from a hard threshold that just says if you're treating X acres, it's considered large scale. And so it really is water body specific this way, and specific to the specific herbicide and the specific location you're planning to control. As for large scale mechanical, it's a little bit different than chemical because effects from mechanical or manual removal are very site specific. So it's easier for us to make a sort of threshold determination for what large scale is. And so we've proposed that large scale mechanical control is over more than 50% of the littoral area. And as a reminder, the littoral area is the area of your lake where light can reach the bottom of your lake. So that's kind of the plant zone you can think of on your lake. So it's very dependent on the shape of the bottom of your lake and the bathymetry and a whole host of other factors. So what kind of monitoring are we proposing with large scale control? We're proposing a point intercept survey before and after control is done using a PI survey. So we got a question earlier about what a PI survey is. So this is just another refresher of that, really, basic version that, we take a boat with a GPS and some rakes, and at each sample point, we gather information about the types of plants and their abundance levels. And we look at that information because it is consistent and repeatable over time. So you take a point intercept survey before the control, the large scale control, and then you take one afterwards, and that gives you a snapshot of what changed as a result of the control. What plant species are no longer there or grew in abundance as a result of the control, or whatever it might be. But it gives us a snapshot in time to compare and contrast and look at the causation of the control itself. How will that data be used? Because it's standardized and repeatable, members of lake associations, consultants, the permit applicant, and the DNR can all look at the same information to help have conversations about the next steps forward. All the data will be included in the next plan update summary, will be used to evaluate the success of the control, be used to evaluate the effects of control on the aquatic habitat, and that data can build on itself over time. If, say, in a 10-year period, you're doing a handful of large-scale control efforts, you can use that data to inform smart decisions about your lake management going forward. Is there any other monitoring proposed in the rule? If you are not doing large-scale control on your lake, no. If you are doing no large-scale control on your lake, the only monitoring that would be occurring would be every 5 years with your plan update with a PI survey. The only small component that has changed, or what we're proposing, is on the permit application, we ask for verification of the target species, but this can be accomplished a number of ways, including a photo of the plant itself, or past monitoring data from planning, or if you wanted to do another survey of some kind, you would certainly be able to do that. So there's a lot of ways to accomplish that, but it would, I guess you could technically consider it monitoring because it's asking for a piece of very simple data. So I kind of breezed through that. Are there any questions there?
So at the moment, we only have one, and the question was who performs the calculation? I think that was as to the percentage between the percentage as to when something is treated as large scale.
Yep, for the chemical calculation.
Yeah.
So it's a part of the permit application. Most permit applications are submitted by the contractor that you've hired to do the chemical control. That's not always the case, but I think I couldn't give you a specific number, but the vast majority are submitted by the chemical contractor. So, and they would be the person who would know what chemical they're proposing to use, the rate they're proposing to use it at, the depth, etc. One part I didn't touch on here, because it might be a follow-up question, we did add some possible amendment pieces to the permit application. And this is one of those components, because sometimes when you're submitting your permit, you don't necessarily have the, all of the specifics figured out. And so say you change your mind or you update the chemical that you're going to use or the rate of application or whatever it might be, you can come back and make updates to this calculation as well, into the growing season as things change.
All right. Is there a distinction between a private lake and a public lake? Maybe this gets into the pond versus public waters issue.
And that is just that 10 acres threshold. So essentially you can just keep that in your head of if it's over 10 acres, these components that I've discussed here are relevant to you. If you're under 10 acres, a lot of these components aren't relevant to you. I'm not going to touch on ponds much. Well, I actually don't even have them in here. We do have a lot of information on that part of the rule if you are interested and you want to look at what specifically is required of you if you're a water body under 10 acres. And we'll have that information up on our website too in the next week or so.
Few more questions are coming in. One kind of, well, it was a specific question by someone, but I think this is actually a pretty good general question to answer people. The question was, who's my DNR contact? How do I find out? How do I find that out? What's the best way to find the people that you need to talk to at the agency?
That's an excellent question.
So, yeah, and also as you find this, I tried to anticipate as many of things that you would want to have put into the chat, and I've failed on most of them, unfortunately.
All right, I'm going to send a message in the chat now. This is our main permitting page. So this has all the information about the permit process and treatment records and guides of how to submit permits. All that information is here. It's just dnr.wisconsin.gov/lake/plants/forms. Link right here is a please contact your local aquatic plant management coordinator before engaging in any aquatic plant management or nuisance control activities. So you click here and it gives you the lake's contacts for aquatic plant management by county. So this is where you find the person that you should be talking to. We also do have some maps, but I don't believe they're on our website. That's something that we should do. We have had some personnel changes, so some of this information is shifted around, but it looks accurate on this chart.
All right. Yeah, I think that's very helpful. That's a good bookmark to make for anytime you're looking for those sorts of contacts, right?
Yeah, and I can send the direct link to this webpage that might be helpful for folks as well, so you can.
Sure.
There you go.
As to the PI surveys before and after control, what time period are we talking about? Is it each year at the end of the season? The comment being that can end up being very expensive.
So the pre-survey can be done. We're not super specific about when that can happen. It could happen the week before you're going to do the control. If you had a survey that was at the same time the year prior, but no management had occurred between, and that could be considered your pre-survey. We're only specific about your post-control survey. That has to be in the next growing season. So it can't be you do a pre-survey in the spring, you treat early June, you do a post-survey in the fall, and then you repeat the next year. The post-survey would have to be at least one growing season following. However, it doesn't have to be at the exact same time as the pre-survey. I wish I had a calendar up because maybe that would be an easier way to show it. So the pre-survey could happen in the same year of control, and the post-survey should happen the year following.
Okay. Yeah, I think that answers the
Yeah.
question. Grace is asking if there have been discussions of webinars in the past with chemical contractors about the proposed rules. So talk a little bit about who else you've been in touch with and sort of the process of discussing this rule with all interested stakeholders.
Sure. Yeah, we have had a lot of contact with the chemical applicator industry in the state. They have been very, very involved in the rulemaking process thus far. We held, this is back to that rules webpage. Back in November of 2020, we had 3 public meetings that went through a bunch of white papers that were kind of our initial policy proposals on the rule. And there are meeting recordings of each of those, as well as all of the white papers themselves on this webpage. And a diverse range of stakeholders were listened into those meetings and provided comments afterwards. Up here, we have the summaries of all of the public comments and questions we received on the white papers in 2 summaries, here and here. They're quite, one of them is actually quite extensive documents. We got over 400 relevant comments and questions from a broad range of APM stakeholders. APM stakeholders are a really diverse group, from tribal members to herbicide manufacturers to chemical applicators to mechanical harvesters to lake association members to pond owners to interested conservation groups. So as you can imagine, that's a wide swath of opinions and perspectives on how our lakes should be managed and how aquatic plants should be managed. And we've gotten a pretty wide range of feedback from those groups.
Yeah, and I've attended many of those meetings and can attest that there is a pretty diverse range of people on all of those that have participated in the whole process. Mark asks, we do several small patches of Phragmites around the lake using topical application. Will we have to send a photo of each site in terms of identifying the existence of the plant?
No, I think it would just be intended to, with that planning process, you would have, with monitoring, identified your general population areas, and then at the actual time of control, it would just be essentially a photo or some evidence to ensure that the person doing the treatment can correctly identify the target species.
Okay. A follow-up comment to the 10-acre question. They're saying that they've been told that they're not a public lake in a recent DNR hosted meeting. I'm trying to think if there's an instance when something might be called not public in a different context.
So there's public in that there's public access, where your lake may not be a publicly accessible lake, but all waters under our administrative rule are considered waters of the state. And that's everything from a teeny tiny backyard pond to portions of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior that are in state boundaries. So pretty much if it's wet, it's a public water that we regulate. So that's how I would think about it. The 10-acre threshold is just an administrative sort of lever we've put in there to split between smaller water bodies and the other broad range of water bodies sizes that we see in the state. So I hope that makes sense. It can get really, there's a lot, we could get into a lot of detail about public waters and the law there, but just to keep it simple for aquatic plant management, if it's wet, it's a water of the state and we regulate it for chemical control of aquatic plants, mechanical control, et cetera.
I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. I was thinking that sometimes it's also, there's confusing terminology sometimes used. For instance, if you live on an impoundment and the question of whether the lake bed is owned by the state, the way those waters are described is sometimes, frankly, inconsistent. That can lead to that sort of confusion. So I think that's, as far as APM, that's a good way to think about it. I think there are a couple other questions about the timing of the PI survey, but I think those got covered by what you said. Let's see. There have been a couple of questions I think that have kind of, and I've actually had this issue raised, question raised to me by a couple of people. So maybe I'll give you a chance to respond to it. The fact that, for instance, here Dan adds that they do an early season survey in June, a peak biomass survey of Eurasian water milfoil in September, PI survey every 3 years based on their grant schedule and comprehensive lake plan schedule. What's being suggested is going to add some cost to lake associations, but with lake districts as well. Districts certainly have an easier time, perhaps, of raising the funds necessary to do that. Has there been a consideration as to how this is going to impact the finances of lake associations, how it interplays with accessibility to surface water grants and those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's a obviously that's a little bit more of a comment than a question, but it's a good comment. And as for the analysis, as part of the rulemaking process, the department has to conduct an economic impact analysis, which looks at how the rule proposal will impact the state economically. That report is publicly available. We had a public comment period on that last fall, and we made some modifications to our economic impact analysis based on the public comments that we received. And the most recent draft of the economic impact analysis is on the permanent rules webpage and available for folks to take a look at. So that's where we have all the information on our analysis of the impacts of the rule economically. And that's a good comment about how some of these components are going to shake out and how this program will work with the surface water grant program to help meet some of those needs for some of those lake groups. It's certainly a good comment and something we have to continue to consider and keep discussing. So we appreciate the comment.
So a question, does this apply only to lakes greater than 10 acres with lake associations? No, it's really to anybody, that any entity, whether a lake association, a district, or an individual property owner or a property owners association that would be doing aquatic plant management, correct?
Right. So that hasn't changed from how things are done now. We don't differentiate. Yep.
All right. Some more clarifying questions. Still confused over fees. A 156-acre lake with a splotch of Phragmites on 170-foot shoreline treated topically. Would that be a $2,500 permit each year?
It would be, it's a $75 base fee and then $50 per acre controlled. So the fee is just capped at $2,500. The fee can't go over that amount, but fee can be less than $2,500. You could treat, if you're treating 2 acres of frag as an example, that would be what, $175 permit fee as an example.
I'm terrible at math in my head, so we'll go with that.
So
it would be less than 2,500 is what you're saying.
Yeah, so $75 base fee plus the $100 of acreage fee, which is $50 per acre.
So it is based on the actual area.
Of
Those fees are
control.
based on the actual area of control, not on the entire size of the lake.
Yes, yes, sorry. I think a question came up earlier and I might have misinterpreted that. Yes, so that $50 is an acreage fee of control itself, not your whole water body.
Got it.
Yes. So that would be, it would be essentially to hit the $2,500, you'd be doing almost a 50-acre treatment of some kind, be
Right.
that harvesting or chemical control or, you know.
And we haven't covered everything else, just hold on. There should be some time at the end to get back to them. There was a question about whether there will be any fines associated with violations of the rule. So what happens if you don't follow it?
Yeah, so there are certainly compliance fines. Those are set by statute, and they are proposed in the new rule, but they're not any different from what is in state statute and in the enforcement code book. I do not know any of those numbers off the top of my head. I will say that the DNR follows a stepped enforcement process where you are not, citation authority is granted to our program. Citation authority, you can think of that like a police officer gives you a traffic ticket, or so you don't comply with your permit, you get a ticket from a warden, as an example. But most compliance issues are dealt with by notice of non-compliance, then a notice of violation, and then an enforcement conference, potentially with some fines, etc. So you can take a look in the rule draft for the specifics on those citation fees.
And not to put you on the spot for statistics off the top of your head, but do you have a sense of how many violations per year happen currently that are enforced?
Not very many. Not very many. No. I don't know a number off the top of my head, but it is not it's small enough that I don't have a number, I guess.
There you
would
go.
Be my
All right. That sounds good. I think that is everything up to now. So we can move on.
All right. So now we're getting into the next steps and where we're going from here. As I've said, the draft rule is out and open for public comment from now to March 1st. There will be a public hearing February 22nd at 1 p.m. So that's kind of the very formal, final opportunity for members of the public to provide comments. That's the kind of hearing where you register to speak in advance, or you can provide written comments as testimony. And then the comment period extends 7 days after that public hearing. So if folks have any final thoughts after listening to the public hearing, they have a week to do so. And after that time, the DNR takes all of your comments and questions to do a final round of edits and changes to the rule draft. So that's back to what I was talking about earlier. Nothing is set in stone. This time is for you all to take a look at what we're proposing and give us some feedback on it. As for how you can get involved, I've shown you our program's webpage a couple times. It has a lot of really helpful background information. As I said, in the next week or so, we'll be adding a lot more there. So that's a really great place to go. Again, you just Google search WDNR APM rules, and it should be the first webpage that pulls up. And also, I haven't pulled this up yet, but the DNR also just has a formal rules webpage that has all of the proposed rules that are ongoing at this time.
I did put that in the chat. So
okay, yep. So I've got that up here. So there's quite a bit. We're water quality, so all the way down at the bottom, but you can see us right here. You can see, as I alluded to earlier, that the economic impact analysis PDF is available here for you to look at. as is the draft rule, and a public hearing notice here with information on how you can register to sign up. And we'll be updating our program webpage, which is the other webpage, with some of those details in the next week or so, so that they're matching. So,
and the
there'll be
public hearing is virtual, correct?
Correct. Yep, it will be a Zoom meeting. And so hopefully that opens access a little bit for folks, so they don't have to worry about travel, et cetera. Also with ongoing COVID restrictions. So that's where you can get a lot of information. I encourage you all to attend the public hearing and testify if you wish to, or if public speaking is your worst nightmare and you just want to provide written comments, you send those to me between now and March 1st. So you've got quite a bit of time. I just wanted to give a little plug for helpful and effective input, because we do want to hear from you. We want clear, direct comments that are relevant and specific, that provide real world examples of how a policy may or may not affect you. If you think something we're proposing doesn't make sense or we need to reconsider it, if you can provide an alternative suggestion for consideration, that's really helpful. Or if you love something that we've proposed, tell us why and how it's going to be useful or effective for you. Comments that just say, I don't like XYZ will only get you so far. I joke with the winky face because we certainly take and we consider those comments, but without some more detail hidden behind that comment, it's hard for us to make a decision on what we should do instead, right? We're not just taking a poll of how many people like or dislike something, because policymaking is way more complicated than that. And there's a whole host of factors we have to consider. So just some helpful tips for you all and how you think about sharing your feedback with us. And how will we use your comments? As I said, we'll take all the comments between now and March 1st. We'll weigh the pros and cons of different policy options based on all of your input and our current DNR constraints. We'll make final edits to the draft board order, and in that, as part of the rule process, we have to show what changes were made based on public input. It's kind of a formal sheet of paper, but it documents all the changes and what comments drove those specific changes. And that final version will get sent to the DNR Natural Resources Board, the governor, and the legislature for approval. So we're slated to go to the Natural Resources Board this summer, I believe in June or July. And if they approve it, then it goes to the governor for approval, and that would be sometime in the fall. However, we're in the middle of a legislative drop date. So because it's an election year, the legislature isn't taking any new administrative rules for consideration. So until the new session opens January 1, 2023, the legislature isn't looking at administrative rules. So even if we get the NRB approval and the governor approval, the rule wouldn't necessarily become law until probably mid 2023 is our expectation of when this would actually become law. But that is obviously just an estimation. After we pass it off to the Natural Resources Board, the rest of the process is really up to those specific entities on the timeline they take to look at and approve a rule. So that's where we're at. So a lot happens this spring, essentially, is how you can think about it. And most of the DNR's work happens this spring. And after that, it's really just moving the final draft of the rule to those final entities for their approval. I wanted to highlight a couple other opportunities to engage on the rule beyond the public hearing that I highlighted. February 1st, the Wisconsin Lakes Partnership Call is going to be focused on the APM rule revisions. So it'll be kind of a similar version to this, but since there's a little bit more time there, we'll maybe expand into some of the details. And then also at Wisconsin Lakes Convention in April, we'll be doing a workshop on the components of the rule and also have a session on basic rule updates. So we're going to do our best to keep everybody in the loop as we move forward. So I believe we got about 8 to 10 minutes left. Are there any final questions?
At the moment, there isn't anything in the chat. I'll just add, as far as that process goes, I think Maddie's right that the legislature, once it goes to the legislature it goes before a committee of the legislature, which can not accept the rule and send it back to the agency to make some changes. We've seen that happen with a couple of rules recently. So that's certainly something that could happen, that could delay this even further. It's just sort of an illustration of how long it takes to get rules through that process. Any other questions for Maddie? Doesn't look like we have anything. If anybody really is burning to say something vocally and doesn't want to type it in chat, if you want to use the raise hand function, I can recognize you. And if you don't know where that is, actually, I don't see it on here anymore. It used to be in your participant list. Well, if you, since nobody seems to have a burning question, if you'd like to, you're welcome to open up your mic and ask it verbally. Otherwise, we can call it a night. Oh, we have one. Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. So there's a lot of rules here about the process for the people on a lake to get the institute the process all the way through the permit. But I noticed the whole thing comes down to whether or not you get a permit approved comes down to the biologist, and the biologist is what, by county, I believe. So are there rules that govern how a biologist provides approval? In other words, is there uniformity across all the counties?
That's an excellent question. And yes, so I didn't touch on it here, but a big section of the administrative rule is the criteria we use to look at permits. So what are all the factors that we look at when we make a permit decision? And those are written in law, and those are what the biologist follows to make a permit decision. So I think that probably the best way would just be to take a look in the rule draft. I hesitate to send folks to the rule draft just because it's in board order format, and it's just a behemoth right now because of the formatting and all of the information that's in there. But I think that would be, Larry, that'd probably be a good thing for us to maybe make a one-page communication piece on what all those factors are when we make permit decisions. I will say that those criteria very few edits were made to those from existing administrative rule. We essentially took what's already in NR 107 and 109 and put it in the new draft, just combining all those factors together. Yeah, but yes.
That would be helpful, I think. And the reason I kind of ask is some of the folks I've associated with have mentioned that some counties are anti-chemical, so there could be a bias as to whether or not a certain kind of permit is approved. So that's good to know that really there isn't anything like that. They have to follow the rules. So it would be good maybe to kind of get that out there.
Yeah, thanks, Larry.
Okay.
All right, anything else? All right, well, I thank Maddie for taking the time for sharing that with all of us. I think that was really helpful. I'm just going to steal the screen away from you and share one more thing. And I want to thank everybody that attended for all the questions. I think it was a great discussion. So give the virtual hand clap to Maddie. And thanks, Carol, for being here and for clarifying some things. And thanks everyone for being supportive of Wisconsin Lakes and for participating in these sorts of things. We'll be doing lots more online presentations and webinars in 2022. We've got some plans. Don't have dates for everything yet, but we're working on it and it'll be on our website soon. But we've got Lakes in Action advocacy training, so teaching you and your organization how to be advocates for the things that are important for you about your lake. Maybe it's advocating about rulemakings. I think one of those trainings could even be just about the rulemaking process and how that actually works, because it is, as you can tell, pretty complicated and lengthy, and it's a important piece of laws and rules in the state. We'll be doing workshops on communications. So as part of our Lake Kit website program, just teaching people how to communicate electronically and some strategies and ways to do that. Lots of other educational and informational things, both with us and with Extension Lakes as part of the Lakes and Rivers Partnership. And the last plug is to remember that the Lakes and Rivers Partnership Convention is hopefully back in person. We're moving forward with an in-person convention planning in April, and you can find out all the information about that at wisconsinwaterweek.org. All of that spelled out. So wisconsinwaterweek.org. With that, thanks again to Maddie, and thanks to all of you. And we'll talk to you next time.